December 7, 1941. The sky above Pearl Harbor turned black with smoke as Japanese aircraft completed their devastating strike against the American Pacific Fleet. In the chaos of twisted metal and burning oil, few noticed the small figures being pulled from the water near the harbor entrance. The first Japanese prisoners of war on American soil, pilots whose aircraft had been brought down during the attack itself. They expected immediate execution, as their military training had taught them. What awaited them instead would shatter every assumption they held about their enemy and reshape their understanding of the world. Before we dive into this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. Over the next 4 years, these men would witness something their commanders insisted was impossible: that America, even while fighting a global conflict, maintained a society of abundance, dignity, and unexpected humanity that would transform enemies into witnesses of a different way of life. Lieutenant Commander Kazuo Sakamaki stood in ankle-deep water, his midget submarine grounded on the coral reef off Bellows Field in the early hours of December 8th. For 18 hours, he had struggled with mechanical failures, fought against currents, and watched his crewmen die from carbon monoxide poisoning in the cramped vessel. Now, exhausted and alone, he waded toward the beach expecting to die with honor. Instead, American soldiers approached him cautiously, weapons lowered, and one offered him a canteen of water. Sakamaki, the first Japanese prisoner of war captured by American forces, could not comprehend this initial act of kindness. In his military indoctrination, he had learned that capture meant torture and death. The water tasted clean and cool. Within hours, Sakamaki found himself in a military intelligence facility, not a torture chamber. The interrogation room had chairs, not chains. The questions were direct but not accompanied by violence. When he refused to provide information beyond his name and rank, the American officers simply nodded and ensured he received medical attention for the cuts and bruises covering his body. That first night, lying on a cot with clean sheets, Sakamaki experienced profound confusion. Everything he had been taught about the Americans, that they were soft, cruel, barbaric, seemed contradicted by his immediate experience. As more prisoners arrived in the following days and weeks, the pattern continued. Ensign Shigenori Nishikaichi, captured after his plane went down during the attack, arrived expecting summary execution. Instead, he found himself in a detention facility where prisoners received 3 meals daily, medical care, and were housed in structures with electricity and running water. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. These men had been taught that capture was the ultimate shame, that death was infinitely preferable, and that American forces would treat them with savage brutality. Yet here they were, alive, unharmed, and treated according to international conventions they had not known existed. Captain James Gillespie, the officer assigned to oversee the initial prisoner facilities in Hawaii, wrote in his daily reports about the profound psychological state of the Japanese captives. Many refused to eat for days, convinced the food was poisoned. Some attempted suicide, unable to reconcile survival with honor. Gillespie noted that it took weeks of consistent, humane treatment before the prisoners began to accept that they were not going to be executed, that the medical care was genuine, and that the Americans truly intended to follow the Geneva Conventions. The turning point came in early 1942 when military authorities made a decision that would prove transformative. Rather than keeping the prisoners in isolation, they began a program of controlled exposure to American society. The reasoning was partly practical, demonstrating America's strength and abundance might yield intelligence value, but also reflected a deeper strategic thinking. These men would someday return to their homeland. What they witnessed and reported could influence post-conflict reconstruction. It was a sunny morning in March 1942 when a group of 23 Japanese prisoners, including Sakamaki, were loaded onto a military transport truck. They had been told only that they were being relocated to different facilities. The truck drove through Honolulu, and the prisoners stared in disbelief at what they saw through the canvas sides of the vehicle. The city showed minimal signs of conflict. Shops were open. People walked the streets in civilian clothes, many smiling and laughing. Cars, dozens of cars, moved through the streets. The prisoners had been taught that America was on the verge of economic collapse, that the military had stripped the civilian population of all resources, that ordinary Americans were starving under the weight of mobilization. The truck stopped at Waikiki Beach. Petty Officer Takeshi Yamada, who had served on a reconnaissance mission prior to the attack, thought there must be some mistake. This couldn't be the same island where the American Pacific Fleet had been stationed. The beach stretched in a long crescent of white sand. Palm trees swayed in the trade winds, and most remarkably there were civilians, Americans in swimming attire, enjoying the ocean as if there were no conflict at all. Children built sand castles, couples walked hand in hand. A vendor sold cold drinks from a wheeled cart. The prisoners were allowed to disembark from the truck under guard. They stood in a cluster on the edge of the beach, perhaps 50 meters from the water, and simply stared. Sergeant Michael O'Brien, one of the guards that day, later described the scene in a letter to his sister back in Boston. He wrote that the Japanese prisoners looked as though they had been struck by lightning, their faces showing not fear or anger, but complete bewilderment. One prisoner, tears streaming down his face, kept repeating something in Japanese. An interpreter explained he was saying, "This cannot be real, this cannot be real." What the prisoners could not reconcile was the sheer normalcy of civilian life, continuing in parallel with military operations. In their understanding of total war, shaped by their experiences in occupied China and Manchuria, where entire populations had been mobilized and civilian life had been subordinated entirely to military necessity, there was no room for beach vacations, for leisure, for the continuation of peacetime pleasures. The fact that America could maintain this level of civilian comfort while simultaneously fighting across two oceans spoke to a depth of industrial and economic power that their military briefings had never conveyed. Flight Petty Officer Hajime Toyoshima, shot down during a raid on Midway and later transferred to Hawaiian facilities, wrote in his diary, later seized and translated by American intelligence, about this exact moment. His entry from March 1942 described standing on Waikiki Beach and understanding for the first time that the conflict was already lost. Not because of any particular military engagement, but because the gap in fundamental national capacity was so vast that no amount of courage or tactical brilliance could bridge it. He wrote, "They fight us with one hand and live in paradise with the other. What must their factories be producing if they can afford this abundance while making warfare across the world?" The beach visit was not an isolated incident. Over the following months, as the prisoner population in Hawaii grew, eventually reaching several hundred as island-hopping campaigns began yielding more captives, the program of controlled exposure expanded. Prisoners were taken on supervised visits to produce markets where they saw fresh vegetables and fruits in quantities that seemed impossible. They visited housing areas where even modest homes had electric refrigerators, radios and automobiles parked outside. They observed construction sites where new buildings were going up even as the conflict continued. Sergeant First Class Hiroshi Kato, captured on Tarawa in late 1943, arrived at the Hawaiian detention facility convinced that he would find American society crumbling under the strain of multi-front operations. Instead, he found Japanese prisoners who had been held for over a year, all healthy, all adequately fed, and all profoundly changed in their understanding of their former enemy. The veteran prisoners told him stories that sounded like propaganda, about the abundance of food, the medical care that exceeded what they had received in their own military service, the absence of brutality or degradation. Kato did not believe them until he experienced it himself. His first meal at the facility included fresh bread, butter, coffee with sugar, and portions of meat larger than he had seen since before being conscripted. When he suggested the food might be poisoned or that this was special treatment to extract information, the other prisoners laughed bitterly. One explained, "They feed us better than our own officers ate. This is not special treatment, this is their standard. This is simply who they are." The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. These were men who had been raised in a society that emphasized sacrifice, austerity, and collective suffering as virtues. They had been taught that hardship built character, that material comfort was weakness, and that their enemies were morally inferior precisely because they were soft and pleasure-seeking. To discover that America could produce both overwhelming military might and widespread civilian abundance simultaneously shattered the ideological framework that had sustained their willingness to fight. Lieutenant Toshio Saito, a naval officer captured after his destroyer was sunk near Guadalcanal, spent 6 months at the Hawaiian facility before being transferred to the mainland. During his time there, he was allowed to listen to American radio broadcasts under supervision. What struck him most was the advertising. Between news reports about operations in Europe and the Pacific, there were commercials for automobiles, appliances, beauty products, and entertainment. Companies were advertising products that would not even be available until after the conflict ended, confident that there would be a market waiting. This casual assumption of victory and prosperity was more intimidating than any military propaganda could have been. Saito wrote a letter to the camp commander, a letter he knew would be read but hoped might be passed to higher authorities, arguing that Japanese military leadership had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of American society. He pointed out that in occupied territories under Japanese control, every resource was extracted for military use, civilians lived under harsh restrictions, and any opposition was met with severe measures. Yet here was America, fighting across 2 oceans and multiple continents, while maintaining a civilian sector that seemed barely inconvenienced. The implications were staggering. The camp commander, Colonel Robert Harrison, did indeed forward Saito's letter to intelligence analysts. It joined a growing file of similar observations from Japanese prisoners, all expressing variations of the same shocked realization that American productive capacity was so vast that the conflict effort represented only a fraction of total potential output. Intelligence officers noted that these testimonies aligned with their own strategic assessments, that American industrial production in 1943 alone exceeded the combined output of Germany, Italy, and their opponent in the Pacific for the entire period since 1939. By 1944, the prisoner facility in Hawaii had evolved into something more than a detention center. It had become, in effect, a re-education program, though not through forced indoctrination, but through simple exposure to reality. Prisoners were allowed to work in agriculture, in facility maintenance, in various labor programs. They were paid in camp scrip that could be used in the canteen, where they could purchase items, cigarettes, candy, toiletries, writing materials, that would have been unattainable luxuries even for officers in their own military. Corporal Yuki Tanaka, assigned to work in the facility gardens, found himself growing vegetables with farming techniques and tools superior to anything he had used on his family's farm in rural Japan. The American guards would sometimes share lunch with the working prisoners, sitting together in the shade and talking through interpreters about farming methods, weather patterns, family back home. These mundane interactions humanized both sides in ways that were impossible to ignore. One particular incident became legendary among the prisoner population. In June 1944, a prisoner named Kenji Watanabe received news through the Red Cross that his father had died in Osaka. He fell into deep depression, refusing food and communication. The camp chaplain, Father Thomas McKenna, visited him daily, sitting quietly outside his quarters, sometimes reading aloud from neutral texts, sometimes simply maintaining a silent presence. After a week, Watanabe emerged and asked to speak with the chaplain. Through an interpreter, he said he could not understand why an American would show such compassion to an enemy. Father McKenna replied simply, "Because before you were an enemy, you were a man, and you still are." This interaction, and others like it, rippled through the prisoner community. Men who had been taught that Americans were fundamentally different, almost subhuman in their materialism and moral weakness, were discovering instead that the capacity for compassion, dignity, and respect transcended national boundaries. It was a lesson that many would carry for the rest of their lives. As 1945 progressed and news of the conflict's end filtered into the camp, the prisoners faced a new crisis of identity. They had survived when their culture told them they should have chosen death. They had been treated humanely by an enemy they had been taught to despise. and they had witnessed a society whose power and prosperity rendered their previous worldview obsolete. What would they tell their families and countrymen when they returned home? Sakamaki, the first prisoner, wrestled with these questions more than most. He had spent nearly 4 years in American custody, long enough to learn English fluently, to read American newspapers and magazines, to understand not just the surface of American society, but some of its deeper currents. He had witnessed the repatriation of some prisoners through neutral countries, had heard their confused accounts of trying to explain to family members what they had seen, had watched some choose not to return at all. In the final months before repatriation began in earnest, the camp administration organized a series of meetings where prisoners could ask questions about America, about the post-conflict world, about what they might expect when they returned home. Colonel Harrison, who had overseen the facility throughout most of the conflict, spoke candidly about the challenges ahead. He acknowledged that many prisoners would face suspicion and stigma in their home country, that their accounts of treatment might not be believed, that the transition from the controlled environment of the camp to a homeland devastated by conflict would be difficult. But Harrison also emphasized something else, that each prisoner had witnessed something important. They had seen that even in total conflict, there were societies that maintained certain values, that honored certain principles, that treated even enemies with a measure of dignity. And while the conflict had been terrible and destructive, the peace that followed would be built on whether people could remember their common humanity. When the first repatriation ship departed from Hawaii in late 1945, carrying more than 200 former prisoners back to their homeland, the men stood on the deck watching the islands recede into the distance. Many were silent, lost in thought. Others spoke quietly among themselves, trying to find words for what they had experienced. A few wept, though whether from relief at going home, anxiety about what awaited them, or sadness at leaving behind a strange and unexpected chapter of their lives, no one could say. Sakamaki, standing at the rail, watched the peak of Diamond Head disappear into the haze. He thought about the beach visit in 1942, about the children building sandcastles while their country fought a global conflict. He thought about the American guards who had learned to pronounce Japanese names correctly as a sign of respect. He thought about the abundance of food, the medical care, the small kindnesses that had accumulated over 4 years into a fundamental shift in understanding. In his pocket, he carried a letter that Colonel Harrison had written for each repatriating prisoner. It was simple and direct, stating the dates of their capture and release, confirming their treatment in accordance with international conventions, and wishing them well in rebuilding their lives. But it also included a final paragraph that Sakamaki had read dozens of times. "You have seen America at conflict. You have also seen America at peace, even in the midst of that conflict. Remember both. The world we build together depends on people who can remember the difference between enemies and human beings." The months and years following repatriation were difficult for most of the former prisoners. In their homeland, society was struggling to comprehend the totality of its defeat, to process the devastation, to rebuild from ruins. The accounts of prisoners who spoke of American abundance and humane treatment were often met with skepticism, disbelief, or hostility. Many learned to stay silent about their experiences, to avoid the stigma of having surrendered, to navigate a society that had no framework for understanding what they had witnessed. But others chose differently. Sakamaki eventually wrote a memoir published in the 1950s that detailed his experiences from the attack on Pearl Harbor through his years in American custody and his eventual return. The book was controversial in its homeland, with some critics accusing him of propaganda or dishonoring the memory of those who had perished. But it also found an audience among those seeking to understand how the conflict had been lost not just militarily, but in terms of fundamental civilizational capacity. Toyoshima, the pilot who had written about standing on Waikiki beach, became a teacher in post-conflict reconstruction. He never spoke publicly about his time as a prisoner, but his students later recalled that he emphasized in his lessons the importance of understanding other cultures, of questioning propaganda, of seeking truth even when it was uncomfortable. His personal diary, discovered after his death in 1983, revealed the depth of his transformation during those years in Hawaiian custody. Saito, the naval officer who had written about American radio advertisements, entered business in the Reconstruction era. He became known for his understanding of American commercial culture, his ability to negotiate with American companies establishing operations in his recovering homeland. Colleagues who knew his background understood that his expertise came from a unique and unexpected education, years of observing American society from the inside as both prisoner and student. The broader historical significance of the Hawaiian prisoner experience extends beyond the individual transformations. Intelligence analysts studying post-conflict reconstruction noted that areas where repatriated prisoners settled often showed faster adaptation to democratic reforms and market economics. The correlation was never definitively proven, but the theory held that these men, having witnessed an alternative system firsthand, served as informal advocates for certain aspects of American-influenced reforms. More significantly, the Hawaiian program demonstrated a strategic principle that would influence American military doctrine for decades, that humane treatment of prisoners was not just a moral obligation, but a practical advantage. Prisoners who were well treated, provided better intelligence, were more likely to cooperate with post-conflict reconstruction, and served as witnesses to American values in ways that propaganda could never achieve. The lessons learned in Hawaii would inform prisoner policies in later conflicts, though with varying degrees of success. For the American guards and administrators who served at the Hawaiian facilities, the experience was equally transformative. Many had entered the conflict with their own prejudices and assumptions about the enemy, working daily with Japanese prisoners, learning about their families and backgrounds, witnessing their humanity even in captivity, complicated simplistic narratives of good versus evil. Veterans of the Hawaiian facilities later reported that the experience made them more thoughtful about warfare, more skeptical of propaganda, more aware of the common humanity that exists even across the deepest divides. Sergeant O'Brien, who had witnessed that first beach visit, returned to Boston after the conflict and became a social worker. In an interview conducted in the 1980s for an oral history project, he reflected on his time guarding Japanese prisoners. He said the experience had taught him that people were capable of extraordinary cruelty and extraordinary kindness, often within the same conflict, and that the choice between them was more important than any military victory. He remembered the faces of the prisoners standing on Waikiki beach, their expressions of wonder and confusion, and he understood that he had witnessed a kind of victory that had nothing to do with weapons or territory. The beach itself, Waikiki, continued to serve as a powerful symbol. In the immediate post-conflict years, as tourism began to rebuild, former prisoners who had prospered in the Reconstruction sometimes returned to Hawaii as visitors. They walked the same beach where they had stood as captives, trying to reconcile their memories with their present reality. Some brought their children, wanting them to understand this place where their father's understanding of the world had been fundamentally altered. One such visitor in the early 1960s was approached by a hotel employee who noticed him standing motionless on the sand, tears streaming down his face. The employee, thinking something was wrong, asked if he could help. The visitor, now a successful businessman in his home country, explained through his adequate English that he had stood on this spot 20 years earlier as a prisoner and had realized in that moment that everything he had been taught was wrong. The kindness of that realization, the mercy embedded in being shown the truth, had saved his life in ways that went far beyond physical survival. The hotel employee, a young man born after the conflict, struggled to fully comprehend the story. But he understood enough to simply stand beside the visitor in respectful silence, two men from former enemy nations sharing a moment of peace on a beach where transformation had once occurred. These individual stories, repeated across hundreds of former prisoners, created a subtle but significant current in post-conflict relations between former enemies. While official diplomacy and economic ties rebuilt the relationship at governmental levels, these personal transformations built it at the human level. Men who had been enemies became, if not quite friends, at least witnesses to each other's humanity. The children and grandchildren of the prisoners who had experienced the Hawaiian facilities grew up with stories that complicated simple narratives of the conflict. They learned that their grandfathers had been shown mercy when they expected death, had been given abundance when they expected starvation, had been treated as human beings when they expected to be treated as animals. These stories did not erase the terrible realities of the conflict, the suffering and destruction on all sides, but they added a dimension of complexity that pure nationalist narratives could not accommodate. By the time the last of the Hawaiian prisoners began to pass away in the 1990s and early 2000s, they had lived through extraordinary historical changes. They had witnessed their homeland's defeat, occupation, reconstruction, economic miracle, and emergence as a peaceful democracy and economic power. Many attributed this transformation not just to external pressure or assistance, but to a shift in collective consciousness, a willingness to acknowledge that the previous path had been wrong, that there were alternative ways of organizing society, that former enemies might have something valuable to teach, and through it all, the memory of standing on Waikiki beach remained vivid. That moment of cognitive dissonance, seeing civilian life continuing in the midst of total conflict, witnessing abundance where they expected deprivation, experiencing humanity where they expected cruelty, had been seared into their consciousness with the intensity of a religious conversion. It was the moment when one worldview collapsed and another began to form. The last verified survivor of the Hawaiian prisoner facilities passed away in 2009 at the age of 92. In his final interview, conducted by a university researcher documenting the experiences of conflict veterans, he was asked what single moment from his entire life had most shaped who he became. Without hesitation, he described standing on a beach in Hawaii in 1942, watching American children play in the sand, and understanding that he had been lied to about everything that mattered. That moment of truth, he said, had been the foundation of everything good that came after. The researcher asked if he felt grateful to have been captured, an awkward question that danced around complex issues of survival, honor, and historical contingency. The old man thought for a long time before answering. Finally, he said that he was grateful not for the capture itself, but for what came after. For the Americans who had chosen to treat prisoners humanely when they could have chosen otherwise, for the exposure to a different way of living that had opened possibilities he never knew existed, and for the chance to carry those lessons forward into a life that had been, despite everything, meaningful and good. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.